go ahead and get started. I realize that there are people who may come later, but I wanted to introduce myself, and maybe we can go around and do the hi, my name is, that we all love to do. So my name is Bertha Dalgo. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology. I'm a genetic epidemiologist with an interest in health disparities. And so I've merged the two to explore genetic heterogeneity in populations like Hispanic Latinos, populations of African ancestry, and those of Asian ancestry as well. So actually that's the R1 that I'm writing right now. The focus is more gestational diabetes, but sort of through that lens. And I was a T32 postdoc on campus, and I think they still have it, maybe not, the postdoctoral fellowship in statistical genetics through the School of Public Health. So I did that 4 years ago now, I guess, because I just started my 4th year on faculty. And today I am talking about implementation science. You're like, where does all of this fit into implementation science? So as part of my K, so I had a K01 that started in 2016, fall of 2016. And as part of that, I proposed to do additional training. And part of that training was training in implementation science through the PRIZE program that's hosted through by UCSF. So I spent 3 summers at UCSF, 2 informal training, and then 1 back for a symposium. And I've actually taken a whole year certification course in implementation science and dissemination. And so I'm completing that coursework at the end of this coming 2019, sort of the spring semester. But as part of that fellowship, gained a lot of insight as to the value of implementation science and sort of how it fits into all of our areas of expertise. And so that's why I wanted to get a sense of what areas you work in, because I think that as I talk through today's slides, I can have a better perspective about what examples to use as we go along.
I'm Colin. I'm a pharmacist in the VA Quality Scholars Fellowship, and my focus right now is in oral chemotherapy. So we're developing a clinic that monitors and adjusts doses for patients receiving oral chemotherapy in the VA.
Nice. My husband goes to the VA. He's a 22-year vet.
Hi, I'm Sarah Rutland. I'm in the medical sociology PhD program, so I'm one of our predoctoral scholars, and I look at unmet need for healthcare in young adults, or in the transition from adolescence to young adulthood, and I kind of focus on racial disparities.
Okay, fantastic. Is medical sociology different than like the Department of Sociology?
It's like a specialized degree in the sociology program.
Okay, so Dr. Keith is an investigator on my R01 that will go in next Thursday. So if I seem a little out of sorts, it's because I have had nothing but caffeine for the last month and been burning the candle at both ends until this round goes in. So, okay, thank you. I just maybe we'll go to the back first.
I'm Megan Black. I'm on faculty in general medicine. And I do a little bit of the VA Quality Scholars Program. I haven't met some of you, but and so most of my work is in patient safety and quality improvement.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for coming.
I'm Joshua Blackwell. I'm one of the TL1 predoctoral fellows this year. Finished my 3rd year of med school in the spring and doing MSPH this year.
Fantastic.
Mostly interested in health services research. This year I'm doing research with linkage to care for patients with hepatitis C.
Okay. So Medicare?
Well, it's technically an emergency department, so
okay.
Just based on their screen.
Yep, okay. All right, thank you.
I'm Ali Kodadati. I also just finished my 3rd year of med school, and I'm a TL1 predoctoral fellow as well. And my research is mostly perceived susceptibility of preventable cancers in the Latino population, and then also HPV vaccine acceptability among Latino parents.
Wonderful.
My name's Jordan. I'm a 2nd year HEMOC fellow. I have a particular interest in the new data in benign hematology, which is systems-based clinical hematology, the implementation of hematologic care processes.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm a VA Quality Scholar. I'm a 3rd year general surgery resident.
And my work mostly in health literacy and how to measure social outcomes.
Oh, fantastic. Actually, one of my other hats in an area of research that we're developing in EPI is science communication. And so we're very interested in this area, or I should say era of misinformation, understanding how things go viral, right, online. So I have a very active social media presence, and learning from that to bring to science that understanding so that we can attract people with accurate evidence-based information as opposed to take elderberry syrup for the flu and you don't have to get your flu shot, right? Which like just unnerves me, but I get it. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues at times, including like lack of access to care and unaffordable care for many, right, that leave them seeking other things. So sort of related, but okay.
My name is Giovanni. I'm a postdoctoral fellow from Italy, and I'm here to the rheumatology department. So I'm a rheumatologist, and I'm working on gout and osteoporosis with Dr. Sai, and that's it.
Oh, fantastic. We just had a speaker from Johns Hopkins, I believe, who's looking at differences in race ethnicity with respect to osteoporosis, and I guess there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about that as well. So a very important area. Okay.
My name is Matt Rabbit. I'm one of the postdoc fellows, also a second-year infectious diseases fellow. My work has been in HIV prevention among men-who men, looking at STIs, and now looking at the PrEP persistence and PrEP uptake.
My name is Jacqueline Lambert Davis, and I'm an equality scholar, and my interest is in caring and nursing.
Okay, fantastic, thank you.
My name is Bruce Julian. I'm in the medical sociology program and a pre-doctoral fellow here. And my research interests are environmental health. I focus on Caribbean population.
Okay.
My name is Alexis Carter. I'm a researcher in the surgery transplantation department, and I've specifically been doing research in living donation and healthy outcomes for people.
Okay, great.
I'm Reed. I'm a DRPH candidate in the Department of Healthcare Organization Policy. I'll be to defend for the next few weeks.
Awesome.
And then putting in a K next year, hoping to use implementation science and mixed methods, looking at expanding living donation and education and awareness.
Oh, great. So some of these slides will be very applicable because colleagues of mine do this work, and I was putting together my slide set, and I reached out and I said, hey, can I use this slide from your slide set? And they said, why don't you just use them all? And I was like, oh. So I integrated some of mine along with theirs, and so together we have a lot of information on, one, where to apply for implementation science funding, and two, some of the elements that are crucial to incorporating implementation science, like what reviewers will look for and so forth. So we'll cover that. And then I think that we had some new guests. So I'll start with you.
John Axley, I'm one of the vascular surgery residents. I'm doing look at perioperative risk stratification for vascular prevention.
Carl Johnson, research fellow with GI surgery, and looking at outcomes between laparoscopic and open techniques for colorectal surgery and a couple other projects.
Oh, fantastic. Do you work with Melanie?
We have some potential projects, but I mainly work with Dr. Kennedy.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I'm Jean Merchant. I manage the training fellowship programs with the core and CCTS.
Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad that we took that time, and it sounds, I think this will help, right? You can hear me now? Okay, great. So implementation science. So PRIDE RISE, for those of you that are interested in training in implementation science, if you look up PRIDE, P-R-I-D-E, RISE, R-I-S-E, it's a program that is available, I believe, to postdoctoral fellows and maybe a preference for junior faculty, but it's worth asking. They're kind of in a period of like non-funding at the moment where they're seeking renewal. But a lot of the work that I heard you describe is actually in line with what implementation science principles would be applied to. And so I think it would be a good program for those of you that are interested in. So, okay, so first I'll give you an overview of what I will tell you over and over again today, and then which includes definitions and scope, because how many of you know what implementation science is? Raise of hands, maybe, kind of, no. Okay, so everyone in this room should know what implementation science is, even if you don't plan to use it. And I will tell you why. So as a genetic epidemiologist, one would think that I would have nothing to do with implementation science, right? I'm really kind of like at the beginning end of research. So I'm in the discovery phase of research with a lot of my work. But how many of you design studies without a biostatistician? Please no one say that you don't. So everyone should raise their hands and say that they design studies with either or an epidemiologist or a biostatistician, because you absolutely need that lens to help you in the design phase of your study. You know, and so those of you that come to the CCTS Biostats clinic and say, I need power for my 3 mice that I have in my experiment because that's all I could afford, you know, I think we've all seen that YouTube video maybe, and it's pretty funny. So anyway, 9 key lessons for implementation science research success. So for those of you that are interested, we'll go over some of the principles of understanding that and how to be successful in that area. And then we'll go through some examples and barriers and alternative designs to implementation science, including pragmatic trials of research as opposed to RCTs, which I think are very applicable to those of you that see patient populations. A recent NIH meeting on reporting, and then some implementation science models and measures, and then tips for grants. So hopefully we'll get to that before time is over. Okay, so how many of you have seen this slide, which takes you through the different phases of research? T1, T2, T3, those should all be fairly familiar. So T0 is really the initiation of the concept of research, right? That leads you to discovery and basic theory. From there, you go on to the development and promising tests, or you have some initial testing or interventions. So T1 or in between T1 and T2 is kind of where I am. So the discovery and basic theory of genomics, but we're also testing some initial theories. So in my case, I was telling Becky this morning that I just had a paper accepted with Nature Scientific Reports, which was a huge deal for me because it came from a grant that I wrote as a postdoc and got funded as junior faculty, and then led to this publication. So in that paper, we found that Mexican Americans are 30% more likely to have type 2 diabetes than all other racial ethnic groups, including other Hispanic Latino groups. So my paper focused specifically on understanding whether the Mexican American genetic ancestry, if you will, right? Like that combination of ancestry that comprises Mexican Americans, even though there's heterogeneity within that, differed and or predisposed to diabetes differently than the ancestry that comprises, say, Puerto Ricans or Dominicans or Cubans, etc. And so we had 66 different background groups of Hispanic Latinos in my sample, which came from the Hispanic Community Health Study, otherwise known as SOUL. And we were able to show that, in fact, you only see this in Mexicans and not the other Hispanic Latino groups, and that it confers some evidence that the loci within, or the variants within this gene, which is the SL16A11 gene, may be a therapeutic target for type 2 diabetes medication. So that was pretty huge, right? So my work is really at the beginning, but Where implementation science comes in is in thinking, how will my work eventually be disseminated and implemented? So I have to use the principles of implementation science to think now at the discovery phase about how we will implement whatever interventions or whatever therapies become available for the work that I have generated. And so one of the things that people think about with respect to genetic studies is what? When you think about like race, ethnicity, and genomics, what are some of the thoughts that you have? So some people think of eugenics, right? So the idea that that genetic ancestry or that genomics will inadvertently lead to sort of a discrimination of or negative consequences because of knowing, you know, what your ancestry is. At the community level, participants sometimes don't want to participate in research because they don't want to know what their ancestry is, right? There is some conflict about what your personal identity is and what genomics or biology says that you are. Race, as we know, and so for the sociologists in the room, is a social construct, right? And so I think that the implications of navigating social constructs with the implications of what genomics is telling us with respect to like predisposition to disease and that sort of thing can get really murky. And so thinking about how you would implement those findings and disseminate that information to the communities that really need it, I think is really, really important. So some of you are further along the line. So some of you are in the implementation and healthcare systems and prevention systems. So for those of you that are, say, in surgery or, you know, in pharmacy and et cetera, you're dealing with things like patient handoffs, right? Maybe like how to implement better systems in surgery so that the handoffs are more accurate and more efficient. So that's one example where implementation science could come into play. All right, so really the diffusion and dissemination and implementation of scientific findings are on a continuum. So you have the diffusion of, supposed to point at this, the diffusion of research, which is a passive process of the information that is out there, whereas dissemination is the active process through which information needs to be pulled out of target groups that are working in specific contexts, and that needs to be tailored to those particular individuals. The implementation, however, requires the very finite identification and assistance in overcoming those barriers, understanding, say, for example, one of the example exercises that we had to do as fellows for this program was understanding what the cost benefit would be if my implementation of the intervention that I was interested in would work. And so I think that I was working on better diagnosing MODY. Do you guys know what MODY is? So MODY is mature onset disease of the young. And so it's a type of diabetes that, that occurs in some populations. And it's often misdiagnosed as a type 1 diabetes as opposed to this genetic version of diabetes. And so basically you have to go for genetic testing. Some forms of MODY don't require treatment at all, whereas some forms of MODY require very specific medications that are different than the type 1 diabetes medications that a type 1 diabetic would usually receive. And so those are the types of things that you can benefit from understanding implementation science in, because it helps you better disseminate the information, not only to the physicians, right, because I would have to work with clinic physicians and or anyone who would diagnose a MODY patient, understand the prevalence of MODY, which is actually rather small. So how do you implement an intervention that would only affect maybe, 3% of the population? Okay, so for those of you that are at the point where you can apply for implementation funding, I'm going to go ahead and put these out there now in case we run out of time. So I think some of you may be too early on for RO1s, but maybe not. So there is an RO1 on the dissemination and implementation research in health. And I have to say that the implementation science arm within NHLBI, so heart, lung, and blood, is very, very helpful and enthusiastic, and they are very welcoming of grants in this area right now because it's a new section within NHLBI. So they're very eager to receive applications. And so if you know of anyone, so you can look this up on NIH Reporter. If any of you are interested in writing a grant, you can look up on NIH Reporter and see if you can write either a KO1 that is similar, a postdoctoral fellow application, right, like an F32 or a postdoc application through a foundation. Or if you're eligible, you can write a diversity supplement on an active RO1. And so that would be one that you could tag along to if you would. NIH also has the Trans Institute Common Fund, so they also have funding, and there's lots of funding from NIDDK coming out as well. PCORI, if any of you are interested in PCORI research, one of my mentors sits on the board of PCORI, and so I can help put you in touch if you're interested. And then there's various CDC and AHRQ and CTSA translation projects that also deal with implementation science. So let's talk about some of the recommendations. So in implementation science, some of the things that you have to consider are the stakeholder perspectives. Whatever your area of research is, there are stakeholders. And so who had the, Allie, you have the research on HPV and vaccination. Okay, yes. So what would be some of the stakeholders in your research project at this time?
Like the pediatricians and their recommendations for this HPV vaccination?
Yes, so pediatricians would be one group of stakeholders. I would think the parents as well, right? Maybe who are the people that are disseminating information about HPV? Maybe the media, right, might be another group of stakeholders because there's a lot of great information about HPV and then not. And then we have some complications in this area as well, right? So we live in the South and there are some views on intercourse and when that should happen, and the timing of the vaccine, I think, is very important. So maybe the churches might be another important stakeholder, right? So thinking through who all of these stakeholders would be, I think, is really important in the design phase of your study as well. Who are all of the people that would be interested in your topic and or amenable to receiving this information down the line? From the outset, ask if this intervention can ever work in real world settings. I think, sometimes we do research out of convenience, right? Or because the data is there and that's the next paper that needs to be written, or this grant sounds awesome, but what are the real world implications? And I think that's what you really need to think about because that's what's going to make the most impact. And so the second recommendation is really understanding the design for dissemination and sustainability as well. And then considering multi-level context. So what is the historical or the political or organizational and team and interpersonal factors that play into both the design but also the dissemination of your project. And then address the external validity as well. So document the relevance, uptake, and experience across multiple levels. So how well do the results generalize across patient, staff, or setting or policy contexts? And are there cost issues at hand? So it's not always about cost, but costs usually play into the equation. And costs are not just dollars, right? So it's time as well, so time of people. I am very active on Twitter. Who's on Twitter? Maybe no one. So I'm very active on Twitter, but I largely follow other academics and physicians and so forth. And so one of the things that I read recently is that, community partners get really upset when we as investigators say, I need you to give me this data for the study that we've been working on, maybe it's a focus group or whatever size study, and I need it by Wednesday because my grant's due Thursday, and, not recognizing that the community partners may have other responsibilities, right, and or time constraints, and that you are not their only priority. And so I think thinking about the costs that apply to other people in terms of time and energy and so forth are key perspectives. Also, the need to document and understand the adaptations. So as you go through the process, documenting what varied, right? So much like you would do in a bench experiment. So I did this today, and then I tried it again yesterday, tomorrow, and this is what changed. And so understanding the variation and how you had to adapt your intervention or your design to fit the problem that you were trying to solve. So a balance between fidelity and adaptation. Understanding that complexity is real and that needs to be addressed. So interventions have multiple effects, not just the effects that are intended or that you intended when you designed it. And so go in recognizing that you have to adapt. And so this is a very, very simple example, but in the implementation of my R01 writing, if we adapt implementation science principles to grant writing, I buffered in extra time for sickness because I knew inevitably Murphy's Law would kick in and either I or my kids would get sick right as the deadline was looming. And lo and behold, I get a call from the school yesterday that I have to pick up my son because he has pink eye, which means he can't go back to school today. And Monday is Veterans Day, which means they're both at home, so I can't come into the office to work. So anyway, so understanding in advance what some of those roadblocks might be and factoring them into your design and or your time. Don't just look under the lamppost. So assess and understand who doesn't participate and why. I think is super important. And who drops out and why, right? So how many of you are working on research where you're recruiting participants? 3 people. Okay, so how many of you have experienced attrition in your studies so far? You've experienced some, okay. And so why, well, let's start with who didn't participate, if you know. And of those that did participate, why you think some of them are dropping out?
The non-participation, I think, is a travel factor. Patients from all over Alabama were invited to come here and weren't able to make it, or had various things come up. It's primarily targeting not the patients themselves, but their caregivers. So if their loved one had to go to dialysis, they weren't able to attend. That was hosting focus groups here. So
okay.
And then attrition, I guess not as much because it was a one-time thing, but we did have people who said they would come and then didn't show up.
Sure. Yeah. So there is maybe a geographical limitation, transportation limitation. Maybe there's even an economic, right, limitation. And so, yes, absolutely. Understanding all of those things. In our study, we were recruiting, another study that I'm involved with, we were recruiting mothers and children for indirect calorimetry, but also a blood draw. And from the outset, I knew that, if I were to participate in the study with my 9-year-old, he's got nerves of steel. This kid, never cries. He would absolutely be a great participant. My 5-year-old, on the other hand, screams bloody murder at the sight of a needle. So there was no way that I was going to convince him to participate in the study. There's sort of like the, you can't coerce your children, right? There's like a coercion factor that works into research as well. So, so understanding those elements, I think even at the design phase is really important, right? Because we had to shift from venous blood draws to finger sticks at some point, and we were able to recruit a lot more children. And finally, we need more practical models, methods, and measures. So all of these need to be understood by the stakeholders. They need to be user-friendly, sort of getting back at the idea of science communication, right? So we may understand what we mean when we write our grants or our protocols. But if we're working with the community, we need to make sure that they understand them as well so that they can execute them effectively. If we are working, so there were some surgeons in the back, I'm certain that the lingo, if you will, in surgery is different than the lingo in epidemiology. And so making sure that we are speaking somewhat of the same language so that if we are collaborating, that we both understand what's happening. All right, so implementation science. So here's a pragmatic challenge. So we've all heard of the gold standard RCT, right? Traditional RCT study the effectiveness of treatments that are delivered to carefully selected populations under ideal conditions. The idea is that you eliminate as much bias as possible up front, right? But this makes it really difficult to translate the results from RCTs into the real world because how much variation is there in our daily lives? A significant amount, and from person to person. So even when we do implement a tested intervention into everyday clinical practice, we often see what we call a voltage drop. So a dramatic decrease in effectiveness. So Catherine Kaiser's in the room, and she's worked a little bit on RCTs and like very familiar, especially I think in the world of obesity. So what would you say is the most significant voltage drop that is experienced in obesity trials or weight loss trials or nutrition trials?
Well, there's two pieces. I would say one is compliance over time with some, what I call intense or severe interventions. People are put on both a diet and exercise intervention. Most people's lives won't sustain that space to do that thing for very long. And so you'll see this typical check mark across time of about 3 months is the point at which the weight goes low and then it slowly starts creeping back up. Because people can't really sustain the heavily intensive interventions. And then I would say the other thing tends to be the translating from epi into real world with single food type interventions, so targeting sugar sweetened beverages or increasing fruits and vegetables. The epidemiology literature says there's a significant association with body weight of this thing, and then we test it in RCTs and we see nearly no effect because energy balance is a lot more complex than just how many sodas you drink a day. So.
Yeah, fantastic example, thank you. So if we want more evidence-based practice, then we need more practice-based evidence, right? And so I think that's what some of you in the room, maybe all of you in the room, are trying to accomplish through your work. So there was a paper published quite a while ago, but actually more recently as well, that discusses the 17-year odyssey. So from time that it's determined that your work or that some work is a research priority for funding, right? Because that's the reality that we're faced with, is that not all important research is a priority for institutes. To the time that there is funding available, population needs and demands, and that the results are available for the studies that have been conducted during this time, it's about 17 years. And so when I was in this PRIDE fellowship for implementation science, I was thinking, so think back to, what was it, like the second slide where it's like T0, T1, T2, right? So I'm like T1. So I'm thinking like, how old am I gonna be by the time that I am seeing the fruits of my labor? I'm gonna be pretty old, I think, if we continue to go at this rate. So we need to think about what is more pragmatic about the research that we will undergo. And so a pragmatic trial is a real world test in a real world population, whereas an explanatory trial is a specialized experiment in a specialized population and often optimal setting. So the explanatory is sort of your ideal condition, right? Pragmatic does not have to mean less rigorous. So you can still incorporate all of the same people and all of the same rigor, but you just have a different lens through which you're looking at your design with, right? And that is being pragmatic. So practical pragmatic trials have some key contextual characteristics, and they include multiple heterogeneous settings. So I think of the example of my friend who's an anesthesiologist who is really interested in handoffs. So from the physician to the anesthesiologist to whomever else is a part of her world. I have no idea because I'm not a physician, but she is, so she gets it. So she wanted to understand handoffs in multiple clinical settings. So in after surgery, for example, she wanted to ensure that the same information was getting from person to person to person so that the care was not only efficacious, but accurate. And she was going to do this not only in her hospital, but in hospitals across the US, right? I think she had like 50 hospitals that had signed up for this work. So that included diverse and representative populations. It enabled the comparison of conditions, right? Because here are real world alternatives that are built into your design already. You have multiple outcomes that are important to decision and policymakers because now you don't only have a single hospital that this was done in, but it was done in 51 hospitals across the US. So this idea in epidemiology that your results be generalizable, right, I think is a key concept of implementation science as well, and these pragmatic trials. And it begins with and focus on stakeholder perspective. So really incorporating all of the people that are involved, that will be affected, etc. So what are some of the key differences between a traditional RCT and a pragmatic control trial or a PCT? So the goal. So the goal for a traditional RCT is to determine the causes of effects of your intervention or your treatment. In a PCT, you want to improve practice and inform clinical and policy decisions. So there's a slight shift, right? It's a little less perfect and targeted and ideal, and it's more what is really going to work, right, is the goal. In your design, test the intervention against placebo using rigid study protocols and minimal variation. So in a PCT, you have tests of 2 or more real-world treatments using flexible protocols and local customization. It obviously requires a lot of note-taking and record-keeping and ensuring that you truly understand what the variability and adaptability was during the intervention. For RCTs, the participants are highly defined and carefully selected, whereas in a PCT, they're more representative, right? Because eligibility criteria are usually less strict. For measures, the data collection is required outside of routine clinical care because this is a very controlled environment, right? Whereas in a PCT, you can have brief and designed surveys so that you can collect data within maybe a clinical setting, right, or a community setting, and it's easily adaptable to the places where people are already. So in the back, when we were talking about science communication, where is your data collection happening?
So it was a health literacy validated survey that was given prior to discharge after a 48-hour post-operative hospital stay.
And then how did you assess literacy?
So we didn't look at like actual reading ability. We just asked them. They were all in-person interviews, and they were asked 3 questions like, how comfortable are you reading hospital material? How often do you have to have someone explain your medical condition to you? And then how confident are you filling out medical forms?
Okay.
That's the brief health literacy tool, and it's a score.
And this was all real time? Yes. So you didn't like bring in people for focus groups and yes. Okay.
All of those surveys were developed in primary care literature, and we're now trying to use them in surgery population.
So that's more of an example, I would say, of a pragmatic trial, right? A pragmatic experiment, if you will, because you're not taking people outside of their usual context, but rather delivering the intervention at the time that they would normally be seen or be going through this process anyway. So that's a great example. So, and then the results then differ in terms of, you know, with an RCT, they're really rarely relevant or maybe not relevant for an extended period of time because there is an issue of sustainability. Whereas with a PCT, it's useful in everyday practice, right? Because if you find this health literacy tool effective, then now it's something you can incorporate into your everyday practice and or usage. And so it's important, especially for those that are in clinical decision making, because you now know that this works real time with real people. All right, so we talked about the continuum, the pragmatic or the PCT also works on a continuum, and it really kind of works on the 10 domains of a spoken wheel diagram. And so some of the things to help you remember what you need to incorporate are that you have eligibility criteria that are somewhat flexible, flexible intervention, practitioner expertise that can be experimental, right? Because this is not an RCT, and so you're just sort of not necessarily going with the flow, but you're going with usual flow. Make sure to incorporate an intervention for comparison, incorporate practitioner expertise and follow-up intensity, really understand what your primary outcome is and communicate that to the people that are involved in the study as well. Consider participant compliance, but also practitioner adherence, right? Because you want to make sure that the people that you're asking to do this are truly committed and they will adhere through the duration of the intervention. And then think about what things will be incorporated in your primary analyses so that because there is so much variability in your data and you have maybe some adaptation that occurred throughout the intervention, that you think in advance, right? So I would work with a biostatistician, for example, and say, what happens if these variables change over time and or if they vary in definition, right? So if there's a change in definition over time, how will we adjust for that, or how will we account for that in the statistical analyses? And so that way up front, you have some security that the data that you're collecting will actually be usable. So pragmatic trials are an efficient way to summarize how, or PRECIS rather, is the type of summary that can be used, and actually it's been highlighted in health services research in this publication from 2012, and it really gives a good synopsis of how to be more efficient in summarizing pragmatic versus explanatory projects on multiple dimensions. So we looked at the 10-wheel spoke continuum, understand how comprehensive reporting works, and helps to increase transparency and inform researchers as well. So understanding the potential adoption of different settings and who the different decision makers will be. So for those of you that end up training in implementation science, one of the things that I did not expect was a lot of theory training. And so Dr. Kaiser is in a Department of Health Behavior, and so she is more well-versed and exposed to theories on a usual basis. But one of the more commonly used theories in implementation science is re-aim. And so the re-aim theory helps with the translation piece of the implementation of your intervention. And it has both an internal validity and external validity perspective. So for internal validity, you consider the magnitude of the effect of the key indicator of readiness for translation for your intervention, right? And whether or not it adheres to the principles of evidence rating for determining efficacy. For external validity, you pay attention to intervention features that can be adopted. and delivered broadly and have the ability for sustained and consistent implementation. So consistency, sustainability, these are the things that you need to really think about when you're thinking about the effects of implementation science on your intervention, and whether or not it can be done at a reasonable cost, right? And we talked about cost being dollars, but also time. Whether it will reach large numbers of people, especially those who will most benefit, and produce replicable and long-lasting effects. So re-aim is to increase reach, increase effectiveness, increase adoption, increase implementation, but also increase the maintenance. So can the results be sustained at the individual and setting levels? And so here are some questions that you would ask if your intervention is ready for implementation. What percent and types of patients are reached? So there's actually a calculator that can do this. So if any of you are interested, it's on an Excel sheet. If any of you are interested in determining if the work that you're currently doing is ready for implementation, you can actually calculate the number of people and or patients that will be reached. For whom will it be effective? So we'll calculate effectiveness as well. Cost, right? Like how many dollars will be saved if your intervention is effectively implemented. Consideration of the percent and types of settings that are adopted, and then how consistently different parts of it are implemented, at what cost and at what rate is also really important. And how well are the intervention components and their effects maintained? Okay, so health equity implications. So when we think of health equity, what are some of the things that we think about? I automatically think of race ethnicity because it's my area of expertise, right? But what are some other equity issues that we would consider? So let's talk about like, so you're working with pharmacological outcomes, right? For cancer treatment, cancer.
So just general oral medications that are used to treat malignancies.
Okay. And so what would some of the health equity issues in your area be?
So outside of the VA, the biggest issue is cost. So a lot of the insurance plans don't cover these new oral medications. So the biggest issue would be people who don't have good insurance would never be able to use these medications, even if they're the first line treatment for their disease.
Wow, okay, and there's no alternative. Like either you have the insurance or have the money.
Yeah, and that can be $30,000, $40,000 a month for some of these.
So this is a significant health equity issue, right? Because, you know, what percentage of the population that's affected by cancer and eligible to take these drugs would want to take these drugs? Probably 100%. And so what percentage, you know, you would have to calculate in your determination of an intervention to increase, for example, maybe uptake or allow for the increase of uptake of these drugs, what the cost benefit would be, right? If we get these people these drugs, what is the benefit to public health, to medicine, to the hospital system, et cetera? And what is the overall impact? And so for each of these AIM components, reach, effectiveness, adoption, et cetera, you would make these kinds of calculations or estimations to understand the benefit. So re-AIM is currently used. It was popularized by Glanz and Reimer. I have the book if anyone wants to borrow it. It's been used in public health for some time by the CDC and VA and other institutes or institutions. Has been widely published, and you know, some would argue that implementation science is a new like buzzy word, right? In social research, I would say that even if it is, I think it's an important concept to work into our design and implementation or design and execution of research that we're all involved with. Okay, and then if you're interested in e-learning, that link at the bottom, and I can share these links with you later, is available online. And I could be wrong, but I believe that edX also has information on implementation science, but UCSF and some of the other partner institutions that are implementation science funded centers have a lot of online material that's readily available that you can access. Okay, so the cost evidence. So we want to consider what are the replication costs. So let's say that your intervention works, right, and it's effectively implemented, and you didn't have as wide variability as you would have liked, or generalizability, I should say. So maybe you did this, whatever work you're interested in like 50 clinics or 50 churches, or whatever it may be, but you want to take it on a grander scale. Think about the replication costs and how scalable it is. Consider the perspective of the patient in the adoption setting. The cost should be comprehensive so that they are both standard and transparent. One person's costs are another person's profits. So think about who's profiting the most, right? And to whom it's the larger cost. Because often the larger cost is on the participants, right? And not so much the investigators or clinicians or whomever it is, because that's just part of their daily work. And so consider that as you look to design your interventions. Cost effectiveness analysis need not be overwhelming. There are lots of tools to achieve this. Lots of people who can do them readily. So I don't think that should be that big an issue. But really, understand that the cost should be harmonized, and you should include things like recruitment and overhead and preparation and supervision of the implementation of your work. So as a summary for REAIM, it's an outcomes framework that can be used for planning, implementation, and evaluation. I highly recommend it. We used it for all of, I think we had like 12 interventions that we were working on at the time that I was training, and REAIM worked for all. So it's fairly generalizable. Each REAIM dimension is an opportunity for intervention, and so you don't have to focus on REAIM as a whole for one intervention. You can use just the reach or just what were the different effectiveness. So you can just evaluate effectiveness or adoption or implementation or maintenance. So you don't have to use all of them at once. And methods exist to combine and summarize REAIM outcomes. And so if you do want to use all of them, then make sure that you're using the appropriate tools to evaluate all together. All right, how are we doing on time? We're done at 9:15? Okay, so let's see. I'm going to skip over the examples and go to these. For those of you that are interested in writing grants that incorporate implementation science, I want to go over some of the elements that have been written in successful grants and what some of the reviewers are looking for. So this is specific to R01s, but there are elements that can be incorporated in postdoc fellowships or training grants as well. So combination of diffusion of innovations and REAIMs, or the REAIM theory, is probably the least used, but more commonly used are no theory or framework, which is really interesting because I think that it should be based in something. And honestly, I think that comes down to people not fully being comfortable with the theories that are relevant to implementation science. And so I have to tell you, for the current R01 that I'm working on, we're looking to understand the association between neighborhood adversity and gestational diabetes. And I'm a genetic epidemiologist, so I wanted to know if DNA methylation was mediating the association between neighborhood adversity and gestational diabetes. And then similarly, if you think about like a diacyclic graph, right, like a DAG, a causal a causal graph. Similarly, I was interested in whether those who have GDM, if there is an association between neighborhood adversity and progression to type 2 diabetes among GDMs, and if DNA methylation mediated that association. So I'm sort of the DNA methylation expert, right? And I have some health disparities experience, but probably not like the sociologists in the room or the sociologists on campus. So I went to Dr. Keith in sociology and I said, can you help me interpret what the neighborhood adversity scores will mean and what the different components of the neighborhood adversity I need to consider in my analysis of these, potential associations and mediations. And so you partner with people, right? You bring on people who are experts in that area. Similarly, Lori Harper, who is at OB-GYN, is a collaborator on my grant. I have a statistical geneticist. I have an epidemiologist whose focus is gestational diabetes. And so you bring all of these partners into the development of your intervention. So then it's not just you thinking of all of the potential aspects of whatever intervention you're interested in, right? But that you have other people who can contribute to the conversation. So I would not suggest having no framework in your implementation science proposal. And so for those who did present frameworks or theories, you see that they used a number, including cognitive behavioral theory, a quality assurance model, and maybe some of you or Catherine are more familiar with these other theories. But you don't really see re-aim, right? Except for in about 15% of the applications. And so you also have to think about who is going to be a reviewer on your grant. And one easy way to figure that out is to go and look at the study section that's going to review your grant. And so you go through and you look at the expertise of the reviewers on that current grant and whether or not they've published on a particular theory. But re-aim is probably one of the safest because it's the most commonly used in implementation science. All right, so there are multiple ways to incorporate theories, and there are actually tutorials online, and this is one that I found just doing a random Google search, and it helps you sort of go through the different components of your intervention, and you fill in what the components are, and it will help you better understand what theory components can be integrated into your description. Also, when, where, how, and who, with whom, under what circumstances does the program or intervention or treatment work? So you have to ask, what do I plan to assess? How frequently, when, or for how long, and what kind of instruments will I use? And so that can provide you possible IS-specific answers, like, well, I'm looking for a diverse set of outcomes, right? Including adverse outcomes and costs. Process measures, so what are some of the mediators and the moderators of the associations that you've already established as evidence-based and that you're now looking to implement. Measures at multiple levels that are collected from multiple stakeholders. And then many people will use a mix of qualitative and quantitative data as well. So I highly recommend that if you haven't before, that you engage in some level of qualitative research, because I think that it really helps you better understand on a quantitative level what it is that you're working with, right? Because often the qualitative research is what leads to the quantitative data. Not always, but sometimes. And so it's good experience to have. All right, so let's talk about some key challenges and opportunities for assessment. So challenge number one, there is inconsistent terminology for IS. It's a relatively new area. And so there are people who have been doing implementation science-like work for many years that are vehemently denying that implementation science as a term is legitimate. And so I think that the terminology has changed a little bit over time, so as to fall under one umbrella. And so what some will call implementation science, others may call other things. And so I think you just need to be cognizant of what the concepts and contributors to the fundamentals of implementation science are, so that if you're reading an article and it says implementation science nowhere in the article, that you recognize that it probably is, but it's just in a different frame. Two, the second challenge is constructs of critical importance for implementation science. So it's still really kind of unclear what factors really matter for dissemination and implementation, and I think it has a lot to do with the audience, or those for whom the dissemination and implementation is aimed for. And so the devil is in the details. So because there are different meanings and operationalizations and measures for the same concept, that you have to keep a catalog, right? Or an inventory of the different elements of implementation science, or the different models that are out there, understand what the commonalities are. So if I were venturing into implementation science, I might write a review article, right? On what the different terminologies and or studies and or frameworks that are out there, so that I can better understand what it is that I'm getting into. And then the third challenge is cataloging, assessing, and harmonizing existing implementation science measures. So we need to understand what measures are out there for dissemination and implementation, and what their characteristics are. And then if each use their own measures, make the knowledge about that accumulation available, because otherwise it's very challenging to understand what is out there. And I keep pointing to Catherine, because Catherine and I have known each other for a number of years, and so I'm somewhat familiar with the work that she's done. And she's worked on a number of review articles over the years, and I think that this is probably one of the largest challenges, right, is the ambiguity of terms. And
yeah, well, even just in obesity, you think, okay, body weight, blood pressure, certain kinds of things, but the Obesity Society recently published 5 articles on an HLBI project to try to at least shrink the number of measures and the ways that people measure different body weight, obesity-related outcomes. It's called ADOPT. I forget what the acronym is, but that's the first step to solving this problem, because when you do a systematic review, and across the 10 studies in your review, the outcome is measured slightly differently. It's hard to do the data mashup that you need when you can't harmonize all the numbers necessarily, so it's really difficult. So we're making progress, but it's slow.
Yeah, it's very slow. And same for health disparities research, right? When you think of health disparities research studies, you often think of associations with socioeconomic status or disadvantage. And I don't know that there is a gold standard for what SES means, because some people include income and education only. Some people consider SES education only. Some people consider family household, for example, as part of the income variable when looking at income per person. And so the gold standard of terminology, I think, is what is lacking in a lot of our research. All right, so the fourth challenge is qualitative information matters. Some would argue more so, some would argue as much as, some would argue maybe not as much as quantitative data. So I'm a quantitative researcher, but I see the value in qualitative data, and so I think that's really important to include so that you can identify observational approaches as well. And then finally, the need for practical feasibility and actionable measures. I think that's what's most important about implementation science, is that there needs to be something that is actionable at the end of the day, that is sustainable, that is quantifiable. And that's where I think that some of these papers under examples and guidance are really important, and that you can look up if you're at all interested in this work. All right, so I think I am going to conclude. I can share all of these with you, and it will include some resources for training and funding, as I mentioned. So some take-home points: know that no implementation science model is the best model out there, because I think it really is going to depend on the type of research that you're doing. But matching the right model to the right research question, I think, is of utmost importance. Adaptation of models might be necessary, so you might need to say, I'm interested in re-aim, but I'm gonna just, you know, tweak it a little bit so that it really fits my research. And full integration of models is really key when possible. And then understand that there's a really important need and gap for practical measures. And then that's sort of the mindset that I would say I would recommend you go into your research with, right? So even in genomics, I think, how is my assessment of, you know, DNA methylation in type 2 diabetes going to help out my aunt who is a type 2 diabetic? Like, that's always a question in my mind. Like, ultimately, how is this going to translate to the people who really need the information, right? And so maybe I can say, to some extent, that her stress or her diet or her lack of physical exercise, or maybe, because we cannot get her to exercise, but you know, those things are influencing or affecting the DNA methylation, chemical stressors, right? They add to chemical stressors that are quantified by DNA methylation and somehow affect the turning on and off of genes that lead to type 2 diabetes. If I can get to the point where I can say that, and I can say, okay, now this is how we take those loci and figure out how to intervene on them, then, you know, I've now used elements of implementation science to sort of guide my work. Think about what the past lessons have been. So both in terms of publications, so read implementation science publications for your area. You can look at what grants have been funded and if they've been completed, what the results have been. And there is a rich array of resources that's available on this topic already, even though it's a fairly new area of work, both at the local, national, and international level. So make sure to look for those. So this concludes my 2-hour presentation at 8 in the morning on a Friday. I actually, my first year of PhD, I'm from LA originally. And so, you know, in LA, there's traffic everywhere. So I would just show up late, like inevitably 5 to 10 minutes late, maybe 15 or 20. Stuff. And so my first year of PhD, I had an 8 a.m. class on Fridays. Jerry McGuinn, for those of you who know him, always has an 8 a.m. class on Fridays. And so I was inevitably always late. And one day I texted my friend, Tiffany Carson, who is now in preventive medicine, and I said, tell McGuinn that I'm going to be late. And she texted me back and she said, he says he's not surprised. So I was never late again for my 8 a.m. class because I was now a Bayesian example for promptness to class. So thank you for not falling asleep at 8 a.m. on a Friday. If you do have questions, my email is available. And if you're interested in my research, I'm also welcome to talk to you about that. So with that, I close.